I'm super excited to talk about recruiting ops, recruiting operations. To me, this is one of the most interesting places within HR and talent acquisition recruiting where, there's a lot of innovation happening. We're sort of maybe getting inspired from the best practices of other places within the business world and the rest of the organization. Before we jump into all that stuff, would you mind just giving us a little bit of a background on yourself and what you currently do?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I'm excited to share a bit about my experience here. And also, I'm very new to the recruiting operations and even talent world in general. Hence my first 90 days in recruiting ops. It's been actually, let's see, I joined Clear Street back in November. So it's been a little bit more than 90 days at this point. But previously, I'm coming from the consulting world. I used to work for IBM in kind of a business and technology consulting role where, I spent a lot of time implementing and configuring IT systems for very large clients. Prior to that, I had some experience in the startup world. I worked for a company called Love Pop Cards out of Boston, which was a pop-up greeting card company. Although I was doing similar work to what I was doing at IBM, which was, software systems implementations for the most part. Like I said, I joined Clear Street back in November in this recruiting ops manager role. I had known, our head of talent at the time, and I was kind of talking to him when I was looking for a new role. And, our conversation was initially just, what sort of things should I be thinking about as I'm looking to make an exit from consulting, and it slowly kind of transitioned into a recruiting operations might be a good fit for somebody like you. And then, lo and behold, the role opened up on the team here at Clear Street. So it was kind of an interesting path. It was not something that necessarily I was seeking out, but as I was going through, a job search, it seemed like a very natural fit for me.
That's awesome. And can you give us a little bit of insight into what is recruiting ops and what does this team do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and this was a question, by the way, I was asking myself as I was exploring this role and trying to figure out, what I wanted to do. I was able to speak to some people who were in the recruiting ops field. It's similar, financial technology companies like Robinhood. I also spoke to somebody who had done recruiting ops at Facebook. And it's something that not a lot of people hear about or know about because it's honestly, in a lot of ways, a burgeoning field. Most people have heard of recruiting or headhunters and are familiar, at least generally, with what those people do. But this whole idea of a team to manage the operations of a recruiting team it's new and forward thinking in a lot of ways. So, I think it's akin to, many other operations roles. A lot of people are familiar with like a sales team and then a sales operations role. We are the team that is charged with basically all of the processes and systems that our recruiting team uses. So we're not just managing, the software systems we use now. We're constantly on the lookout and evaluating new systems for the team to use. We are digging into the data that's coming out of our recruiting processes and looking at answering, basic questions like time to hire, cost per hire, and things like that, and kind of diving into those metrics and seeing what we're doing well. What areas of improvement we can identify, and then based off of that, creating projects to make our team as efficient and cost effective as possible when it comes to bringing new people to join the company.
That's awesome. So it's basically a strategy consulting role for this recruiting organization, with the difference between what you guys do in McKinsey is you're not just doing a PowerPoint, you're actually going to buy the tools, you're going to implement them, you're going to be sort of in the trenches doing the nitty-gritty execution work, in addition to the higher level, let's understand the processes, the systems, and see where we can just be better.
Absolutely. And it's parallel to consulting in a lot of ways, which I think is why my background fit in pretty well to this sort of role. But that's a great way of summarizing it.
Yeah, I guess it is really fascinating that you didn't come from a recruiting or talent acquisition background. What are you, for people out there who are watching this who are like, I'm interested in working in recruiting ops, what do you think are some of the skills that you need as an individual to join one of these teams?
That's a great question. I mean, it's the thing about recruiting operations and why I was able to transition to this role without much experience in the field is because, it's really at its base, just it's a problem solving sort of role. We do deal with data. Like there is absolutely a need for somebody with strong data analytics. Doesn't need to be super advanced. Just anybody who's pretty well versed in Excel will do well here. But at the end of the day, unlike some roles where you can get into really abstruse parts of complex businesses, the recruiting data in and of itself is not that complicated to interpret, right? So you're not dealing with very complex data. It's just you are oftentimes dealing with high volume of data and trying to glean insights from it like you would, in a lot of other roles. So, the data analysis piece is important. And that was something that I had familiarity with from prior roles. I've used Excel throughout my entire career. And then just anybody that's interested in solving problems that leverage technology. I should probably say that was another part of, my previous roles where I've done quite a few software implementations. So in terms of, doing project planning and project mapping for software implementations that are going to affect, hundreds of people at our company, that's something that I've done before and have some familiarity with. But at the end of the day, anybody that, at least knows a reasonable amount of data, is interested in solving problems and can be a project manager and balance multiple things at once is going to do well in this role. And just like for any job, having an inherent interest in the subject matter is also going to go a long way. And that's something that I was really looking for when I was looking for a new job as well. I find these sorts of questions that we're asking and problems that we're solving really interesting because at the end of the day, our job is to help the company scale, which is exciting in and of itself, but also make sure that the candidates themselves have great experiences. And, maybe if they don't end up joining, the experience is so good that they end up telling other people about it. We want to make sure our hiring managers and interview teams have great experiences. And obviously that's great to see because I see these people in the office every day. And then, the rest of my team, we want to make sure that the process and the systems that we're using and implementing are not overly burdensome for anybody. So it's I mentioned that just because that excites me. I love working with people. So, that's another aspect of the job that I'd say, if you're not really interested in working with people or candidate experience, then it's probably not the right role for you. That may go without saying. But yes.
It's kind of an awesome mix of quantitative systems thinking, strategy, and then also actual humans and seeing your impact directly. Because as you point out, you're helping the company scale. People are bottleneck, great people are bottleneck to scale. And then also you're sitting next to and seeing the people who went through these processes that you actually put in place. So in my opinion, it's a pretty interesting career path. Do you mind just sort of setting the stage a little bit as well about the business, how large it is, how many people you're recruiting, and at what stage did somebody say, hey, we need to think about doing this recruiting ops thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I joined Clear Street, like I said, last November, we were at about 250, and now we're well over 300. I think the last I checked, it was 330. So we've been growing pretty rapidly. And Clear Street, it's a financial technology company, which I think I mentioned before, namely a prime brokerage. That's the largest part of our business. And the company is revolutionizing the technology that prime brokerages use. We're cloud native, it's flexible, it's scalable, very secure. And the reason that the company's been growing so rapidly is because we're able to offer clients, which are mostly institutional investors, access to real-time reporting, which is surprisingly something that's not available for most prime brokerages, as well as our onboarding speed is we generally onboard clients within 2 weeks. At our competitors, it can take up to 6 months. And then also being on the cloud is a big, important piece of what we're able to offer. So, we've obviously seen pretty good response from our clients. Our client base has been growing, which has allowed us to grow our employee base. So yeah, it was around 250 people. There were, just a few recruiters at the time. in parallel with recruiting ops standing itself up and becoming a function, the recruiting team itself has grown, and we're now at 8 recruiters and sourcers. So, I think we had kind of reached this inflection point where the company grew to a pretty large size, but our recruiters were so focused on supporting that growth, just, constantly on the phone, bringing people into the business, that there was no person and certainly no team that, really had the bandwidth to start to look into and answer some of these questions. Like, even the basic ones I mentioned before, like, what is our cost per hire? Certainly the data was available, but in terms of having a team to start to look at these things, understand what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, didn't exist. And that is, I have to tip my hat to our, forward-thinking leadership team to bring in a recruiting ops function so early, because I think a lot of the time, that gets overlooked entirely, let alone bringing it in when the company's, at 250 people and growing rapidly. The other thing that recruiting ops has been able to do is help establish systems and processes to allow us to, take a more sort of deliberate headhunting approach to recruiting. Before I joined, the first half of last year, we were using a lot of agencies, and, our recruiters were certainly sourcing themselves, but we're also, kind of processing applications that were coming in from third parties. So since I've joined, and, starting basically with the second half of last year, there was, a deliberate, like, we're going to shift our strategy. We're going to be finding almost all of our, outbound applicants. We're going to be doing that in-house. We obviously have referrals and some inbound applicants as well, but we've pretty much entirely cut out our use of agencies because, bringing in recruiting ops helps support that, because we now have the infrastructure in place to allow the recruiters to more seamlessly source and bring in candidates to, again, help us scale and continue our rapid growth.
The holy grail, cut out agency fees. Whose idea was it to stand up recruiting ops? And do you have any advice? And this was a little bit before you joined, almost by definition, but for maybe a chief people officer or a head of TA or somebody like that who's like, we really need this. How do I get executive buy-in?
Yeah. So, obviously I was not a part of those, like, let's get the job requisition approved. But our chief people officer, I think he and the whole executive team here I think I've said forward thinking like 5 times. It is something that it's recruiting, and as a subset of that, recruiting ops is, I think, seen at a lot of different companies as a support function where, it's not as much of a partnership. It's more of a hiring manager needs this role. Like, you will be the one to, post it, make sure it gets filled. And, that's kind of that. Whereas at Clear Street, and that this has been the case the entire time, the leadership team understands the value of making it a partnership between the hiring manager and the recruiters, where they have, several meetings. They're analyzing pipelines together. They're even sourcing candidates together in some respects. So I think the establishment of recruiting ops is just, an extension of that same mindset. It's, recruiting as a whole is the team that grows the business. And if you're going to treat that like a support function and not like the strategic, technology-based function that it is or is supposed to be, you're just doing yourself a disservice. So, I think our chief people officer, our head of talent at the time, and our entire executive team realized that and decided to bring me in, which I'm grateful for, because it's been a great experience so far.
I love that line, and I feel like it's sort of the lead in to maybe if we write up a blog post about this, it's so strategic, and you need somebody or a team of people to make sure that it's running well. You talked about some of these first kind of basic questions. Do you mind hitting them again, like cost per hire, et cetera? And then what were some of the other sort of first priorities that you had when you first started?
Yep. Well, one of the first things that I did was create a 2021 year in review of recruiting deck, which honestly got sent out to most of the company because, one, that helped me frame what are we doing well, what are we not doing well, and where can we improve? And it also helps show the rest of the business what exactly we're doing. And it's kind of emphasizing that strategic partnership I was talking about before. So in addition to, cost per hire, time per hire, I was looking at the sources of the hires that we made, meaning, were they inbound? Did they find us? Did we find them via outbound sourcing? Did they come from agencies, or were they a referral? Those were kind of the four main sources we looked at. And it was really interesting looking at slicing that data up by different business units across the company. So you can see, maybe our engineering teams are lower on referrals, but much higher on outbound compared to, some of our core finance teams like sales and trading and kind of that side of the house. So looking at source mix was something that I spent quite a bit of time doing as well. The cost per hire, which I've mentioned a few times, is a complex metric to put together when you think about it, because even when an agency is not involved, you have to start to think about the time that people spent to bring this person in. Like, how many hours did our engineering team spend interviewing? How many hours did our recruiting team spend interviewing? How much did we spend on our recruiting tech? How much did we spend on marketing or ads to try to bring people in? So, it seems like a pretty simple metric because it is one number, but that was actually a pretty complex one that took a lot of time to put together. So that's kind of where I started, Phil, to answer your question is, let's see how we've done over the past 12 months. So then that can help me better identify how we want to, move and how we want to kind of create our path forward. I also looked at a few different software systems, and one thing that we wanted to do basically as soon as I joined was put in a system to start to gather candidate feedback, because aside from anecdotal evidence from recruiters and some hiring managers, we didn't really have much data about like how do candidates feel about interviewing with ClearStreet. We have our Glassdoor page, which I think gives a good overall metric, but we wanted to start to dive into like how are individual interviewers or interview teams doing? How do they compare to one another? How do candidates feel about that experience? So that's another project that I kind of started out of the gate, was to get a better idea of kind of quantifying our candidate experience.
And it's interesting how you're talking about a lot of numbers, and I really appreciate that. Like, you're one of the few people actually who's been like, yeah, cost per hires, it's a hard thing to calculate because it's not just marginal cost per hire where we're looking at like Indeed spend versus Indeed candidates or Indeed hires, or it's not just total cost per hire, but it's like, let's look at this like by channel, by role, and understand how are people putting time in, how are hiring managers putting time in, et cetera. And if you get that granular, which you should,
yeah,
it gets super complex, and that's amazing. And the question that I was going to ask after that has escaped my mind temporarily. But I guess one of the things I'm pretty curious about is, what does your tech stack look like on the recruiting side of things?
Sure. So our tech stack is pretty simple. There's just a few systems right now. We use our ATS is Greenhouse, which, again, I wasn't part of that decision of implementing Greenhouse, but I'm glad we use it, because if there's one thing Greenhouse is great at, it's integrating with any other system you could possibly think of. So we use that for our ATS. It's also very user-friendly, which I appreciate. We use Gem for two main functions. Our recruiters use Gem to source and set up email drip campaigns. We also use Gem because it has a very robust talent and recruiting analytics component. So it's got great data and visualizations, also super user-friendly. I actually earlier today just set up automated reports from Gems that are going to send to hiring managers via Slack. So, weekly they can get updates into what does my pipeline look like right now? How many people are in the on-site stage? How many people are in preliminary phone screen? How many applications did we get? So Gem is great for both sourcing, and I know our recruiters use it quite a bit to send messages to candidates, but also for kind of the more recruiting ops side of the business, which is looking at your data, both when it comes to candidates in process, and there's also great data on your outreach statistics. How many messages did you send? How many were opened? How many replies did you get? How many of those replies were positive, I'm interested replies? So Gem is a great tool for your analytics as well. And then the third tool we use is LinkedIn Recruiter, which I think is kind of the gold standard in talent acquisition. It's on when we message candidates through Gem. a lot of times the candidate information emails is coming from LinkedIn Recruiter. We of course use InMails as well, and that's a great way to figure out who you want to source to. So we use LinkedIn Recruiter, and the last tool, which we actually just implemented, and we're finally fully rolling out for all of our roles tomorrow, is called Guide. It's a fairly new company. They just went through their first round of fundraising a couple months ago. It's guide.co is their URL. And that is basically a portal for candidates to basically get a better understanding of the interview process. So there are tabs that you map to each of your interview stages in Greenhouse. So in Guide, when a candidate first starts, they'll see the tab for preliminary phone call or recruiter phone call, and they can see when their interview is and who they're interviewing with, of course. And, there's bios for the interviewer. You can link out to their LinkedIn or whatever else you want to do. And then you can also add content. And this is where it gets really valuable. It's like before the candidate has even entered the process, through Guide, we can unveil all sorts of content about our company and why they should be interested in ClearStreet. And then as they move through the process and advance through the stages in Greenhouse, more tabs in their Guide URL will unlock. So, you don't necessarily want to throw everything at them at once, or maybe there's things that are only relevant for the on-site stage, like, information about how to get to the office that you don't necessarily want to share early on. And you can also just get more and more granular as a candidate moves through the process. And then finally, at the offer stage, you can start to, serve up content about the benefits we offer and further try to sell candidates on why they should accept the offer. So it's a great marketing automation tool and allows us to share content about our business to candidates as they move through the process. And then the other piece of it is that, we're hoping this leads to a really good candidate experience where there's much more transparency about, the interview content, who the interviewers are. And then importantly, which I alluded to earlier, there's a feedback component as well. So once a candidate has finished an interview, they can then go back to their Guide and leave feedback, based on the interview, give us a general idea of our NPS and kind of what we're doing well and what we can improve on. And that's really our full tech stack right now.
That's awesome. So, and thanks for walking us through that, because I think it's so interesting to see what tools people are using in what stage of the process. I guess what's sort of interesting to me as I'm listening to you talk is you are obviously hyper analytical, you're doing a lot of number crunching, but it seems like you're also listening a lot to the unstructured data around people's just sort of general feedback and then implementing changes. Do you have any frameworks for how to look at that unstructured data? Like how many times do you need to see something, or do you bucket it or tag it? And then do you have any anecdotes on, maybe some feedback that you guys got that you changed something in your recruiting process because of?
Yeah. So to address the first part of your question, right, as much as I would like for this to not be the case, like recruiting data is never going to be perfect, right? It's just not a black and white, like concrete thing where you can, everything is just going to go perfectly. Like, especially when it comes to bringing people into a business, there are always, things that are happening that are outside of what we'll call like a standard process. So yeah, a lot of it is just listening to your stakeholders and knowing who your stakeholders are. Obviously hiring managers and candidates, the entire interview team, your recruiters, and yeah, you have to it's really a people focused job, like, because you're right, Phil, it's not all going to come up just, on some report from Gem. You have to hear what people are saying and keep track of these trends, in the way that you see best fit. So, I mean, in terms of the second part of your question was kind of how have we kind of used this more like abstract data and kind of like looked into it and made a change. So, I mean, one thing that we were hearing was from our engineering team that the time and stage seemed rather long, right? Not just the whole time to hire, but like it seemed to certain people that, candidates were spending too long in certain interview stages before they were either, rejected or advanced to the next stage. And that is something that it's hard to dig into. Gem is a great tool, and Greenhouse can do this as well, showing you like how long did somebody spend in a certain interview stage, but it doesn't really get at the why, right? And that's the real question, is like, is the recruiting team just sitting on these candidates, or, you know, is it something else? And we immediately wanted to dispel any sort of rumors or thoughts that it was us not following up with candidates. So that was a situation where I had to, you know, look at individual candidates in Greenhouse and look through their activity feeds. And, you know, this was not as automated as I would have liked it to be, although it is something that we've talked about automating. But basically, I had to look at individual candidates and see, you know, what's happening here. As it turned out, most of the time, you know, we were reaching out to candidates to get their availability, and then we either weren't hearing back from them, or actually in a lot of cases we were hearing back from them and they were providing availability for interviews, you know, 2-3 weeks in the future. So, you know, that was the ultimate answer to the question, and I was able to find enough data to support that. And we started to outline like how we might, you know, automate this sort of analysis in the future. But there are certainly things like that, like HR tech, as I'm sure you know, has been, you know, blowing up recently. So there's a ton of tools that are coming out to make things like this better. But, you know, there are still cases like this where you have to do things, you know, rather manually to get the answer that you want to get.
Yeah. And I feel like that's sort of many times what has to happen, right? It's like we look at the data is telling us something, we don't know why. Let's just look on a case by case basis and try to figure this thing out. And it's pretty cool that you guys have the time and capacity to do that sort of thing. And that's one of the beauties of having these recruiting ops teams. We've gotten a couple of questions from Bob. And by the way, anybody else who's listening, please feel free to chime in with some questions. I'll do them in order, actually. So the first question is, as companies look to fill roles with both recruiting and internal mobility, do you have a seat at the table for overall talent decisions? So I think this is kind of like a strategic, like workforce planning when we're thinking about adding headcount for engineering staff versus sales staff, et cetera. Are you in those conversations?
So one thing I will say is like my exposure to leadership far exceeded what I was expecting coming into this. And by that, I mean, I have more lines of communication with our CEO than I thought I would. Like when I put together that 2021 year in review of recruiting deck I mentioned earlier, like our CEO, you know, had that and talked to me about it. And like, it's been really cool to see and understand how intertwined recruiting and talent is to the overall, you know, executive function. In terms of, am I literally at that table? Most of the times I am not, but our chief people officer absolutely is. And I think it's great that we call it a chief people officer, right? Because it really is. They're strategically intertwined. And I am obviously very in the loop on these conversations. And, you know, I sit next to our chief people officer. We talk every day. So I would say, to answer Bob's question, like the talent team certainly has a seat at that table.
Very cool. And the other two questions Bob had, which I actually was curious of myself, are you guys, it sounds like you don't have assessment or interview scheduling tools. Are you thinking about adding those in the next, I don't know, 12 to 18 months sort of thing?
Yes. Yeah. That's one thing that I am looking to implement soon, is some sort of scheduling automation tool, because right now, you know, it's the recruiting ops team that's doing all of the interview scheduling across the entire business. And I've actually done several demos and had some pretty lengthy discussions with quite a few people in this space. And it's definitely something that we're going to be looking to implement next.
That's great. What about assessment tools?
So candidate assessment tools, meaning like some sort of like technical evaluation for engineers? And
yeah, technical or maybe behavioral, personality, other skills for other roles, or even maybe something like video interviews.
Yeah, so the first part of the question, I would say not really. We do have a tool that we use for our engineering interviews that has an assessment piece. But right now, the tech assessment interview stage is done, you know, via face-to-face interview. And we have developed, in-house the questions that we kind of ask in those sorts of assessments. When it comes to video interviewing, there are some tools that we've been thinking about. One of them that I've heard quite a bit about is BrightHire, which seems interesting because it's not really an assessment tool, but it is a video interviewing tool that allows you to take clips of the interview, like share those easily so that, hiring teams are able to, one, debrief asynchronously, but two, debrief and make decisions on candidates based on actual things that happened as opposed to interviewers' memories of what happened. So that tool is something that we've been thinking about for a while. And, of course, being a startup, priorities are constantly changing, but I have been in talks with the BrightHire team, and it's something that we'll be looking into soon as well.
What sort of cadence do you think a team of your size can add new tools?
That's a great question, and I think everybody has different opinions of this. With the size of the team right now, which is me and 2 other people, and again, since all of our scheduling is manual right now, not automated at all, I think it takes, probably every few months, if you have a team that's about that size, that, it's feasible to roll out a new tool that's going to be used by everybody in the business or anybody that's conducting interviews. But you can also speed that up, obviously, as the team grows, or if, the scale of the tool isn't as big. In the example of Guide, which we're just rolling out now, like I said, this was the sort of thing that I wanted every interviewer in the company to see and be able to give feedback on before we send it to live candidates that they're going to be interviewing. So that obviously has a lot of touch points, and it takes a little bit longer to implement because you have to go through several rounds of feedback and reviews. But if it's a tool, like LinkedIn Recruiter, for example, where it's really just the recruiting team that's using it, you can probably implement much more rapidly, and get things done in a month or 2.
Yeah, it's challenging because if you take on too much, you're gonna not do anything. But you've got to keep pushing the ball forward. And again, it's another one of these things where it's amazing that you guys have the headspace, the capacity, and the mandate to do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. So you have this experience at IBM doing software implementation. You've got this experience. What are some of your guidelines or processes for finding and selecting new tools? Like, how do you go about understanding, do we need this? How do we make a short list? How do we start diligencing these things and then making an actual selection?
Right. Well, the first step's identifying the problem or bottleneck, because obviously no point solving a problem that doesn't exist. And then I think this next step is important and is sometimes overlooked, and it's, is software the right solution for this? And this is actually one thing I'm grateful for regarding my time at IBM, because, there's at least 2 options when you're looking to solve a problem, software or business process. And that's something that I did a lot of, when I was implementing huge IT systems at large clients, is before we look at reconfiguring this system, is this something that we can change, with a business process instead of going through this whole tech implementation or reconfiguration of our existing tech. So there's actually been a few times where we were thinking about pursuing a software solution, and we've started to talk to internal stakeholders, people externally. That's another great thing about the talent space that I will say is people are very happy to share their experience and their thoughts. So I've had the opportunity to network with people at other companies, what do you think about this tool or this tool, or even just what do you think about software for this whole space in general, versus, just something that we could do internally with, either Excel or Google Sheets or just a business process change. So if you've gone through that analysis and then you determine that software is the way to go, then you start your vendor selection process, which for me is a lot of research to understand the space. Again, talking to people. When I was looking through the candidate experience tool, which ultimately we ended up going with Guide, I went on select software reviews and posted a question there. I spoke to people at other companies who had implemented some of these tools or had gone through this same selection process. And then, of course, actually going through the demos and understanding the tools with, whatever your finalists are. And then, when you've reached a decision, making it clear why you did, what the pros and cons were of each. I mean, I've just created pretty simple tables where it's like, here are the systems, here's how they handle each of these different things, pros and cons, cost, here's why I am choosing this one, and here are the second order effects of choosing this versus another one, which is, I think that's an important one to get at too, especially when you're, need to get approval for, any sort of cost, is not just acknowledging why you made the choice you did, but also what's the consequences of not choosing one of the other options.
Can you give an example of a second order effect?
Yeah. So for example, going with guide, they have feedback, but there are much more robust candidate feedback tools where you can basically get better data, and so you're getting more quantitative data. You can also, there were ways that you could trigger surveys from some of Guide's competitors, and it could be a little bit more targeted depending on the role or who the candidate was interviewing with. So, like I said, Guide was definitely not the best feedback tool out there, but the marketing automation and the Guide portal component of it was huge, and that's what really made it stand out. But second order effect of selecting with Guide is we didn't have as much customizability when it came to the questions that were asked when the candidate receives a survey, and frankly, we won't have quite as much quantitative data coming out of it.
What advice do you have for teams that are looking to get internal buy-in for new tools? Like, let's say your team's like, hey, we really need to, in a more robust way, understand the feedback that candidates have about our candidate journey, and we think we should do this. How do you get the budget? How do you get the buy-in from chief people officer, maybe CFO, something like that, so that we can get the money and actually roll this out and have people use it?
Right. So just, know your audience, right? Like the recruiting team and the talent team, if I was talking to them about it, I would say this is going to like increase or lead to more positive candidate experience, right? Like our candidates are going to love using Guide so much. They're going to tell all their friends about how great it was to interview at Clear Street, XYZ. But that's not how I'm going to sell our CEO on approving the cost for it, right? Like what does your audience care about? So in the case for me, like this went right to the CEO. So, I was explaining, how is this going to improve our cost per hire? How is this going to improve our hiring velocity? So going back to that initial 2021 year in review deck I made, I basically took the numbers from that and made some assumptions about how implementing Guide is going to further allow us to cut our costs and grow the business at scale.
Yeah, I like it. And was there like some like calculations in there, or was it just sort of like, here's what I think? Or can you be just a little bit more specific about what you pitched the CEO?
Yeah, I mean, so we looked at how, obviously we had the cost per hire data and we had the people that we were hiring per month. And we basically made some assumptions about how much time it would save to implement Guide, meaning that, there'd be fewer candidate questions. There would be fewer interactions between both the recruiter and the candidate, as well as, the recruiting ops team, the scheduling team, and the candidate. And then maybe in some cases, even the hiring manager and the candidate. So we tried to look at how much time would be saved and then extrapolated that into, cost per hire savings, and an increase in hiring velocity with that freed up time.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it. Perfect way to do it. With the topic of ROI on the tip of our tongues, can you talk about some of the impacts that the recruiting ops team has had in terms of some of these key metrics on the company?
Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier, right? Like we completely cut out agencies. So our cost per hire has gone down over 25% from the first half of last year. So a lot of cost savings there. Obviously, like I mentioned, the company's grown rapidly. It's like every quarter we're setting, new records for, hires per quarter. Looking at our mix or our source mix, which I was mentioning before as well, We've improved that drastically. And by improved, I mean, kind of met our targets for what we'd expect for a company of our size and at our stage. We've got a good mix of referrals, a healthy inbound channel. And like I said, we've really focused on building that outbound channel as well. I mean, at the end of the day, we do track time per hire as well. But if we're able to increase hiring velocity while cutting costs, like those are the two most important metrics that our executive team cares about right now, and that's something we've done really well.
And I like how you're not shy about saying, and the company's grown, right? Because we had a massive impact on that. I think a lot of times folks who are running talent acquisition or HR maybe shortchange themselves a little bit, and they look at themselves as a cost center and they're focused on cost. But you're making an impact on new revenue growth through engineers that build product,
Yep.
Just like the engineering team is. So that's awesome. And especially when you're fighting for these amazing people who are in extreme demand. Do you have any last advice for people that, one, either want to join a recruiting ops team and say, hey, this sounds really interesting for me, or two, companies that are thinking about standing up a recruiting ops organization, and maybe I'm the head of HR, chief people officer, maybe I'm the CEO, COO, and I'm thinking, this is an interesting thing to explore. What should I do next?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in terms of like a piece of advice, just remembering that like at the end of the day, our role is to make sure we can support the growth of the business. So, I've mentioned how important it is to partner with all the stakeholders, make sure that you're a partner with the hiring manager and not just seen as a support function. But also keeping in mind that like your job is to grow the business. So like getting candidates through the door is priority number one. And, implementing a new system or process is really often, or it is important to, supporting that growth. But at the end of the day, like you do want to make sure that you're bringing people in the door. And then when it comes to like the leadership side of it and like, what should I be considering, or is it really worth it? I mean, I think this is the way that this space is moving. If you're continuing to see recruiting and talent as a service function, your growth is going to reflect that. Like in just the short amount of time that I've been here, we've seen some amazing improvement in our hiring metrics, which we've spoken about at length. And it's attributed to understanding the value of a strategic thinking recruiting team. And, I think a lot of companies just rely on that old kind of application processing agency approach. And you can do that, but that is costly. And there's a place for agencies for sure. You can gain access to really unique, sometimes abstruse talent pools through agencies, and there's definitely a place for that. But at the end of the day, it's a strategic function. There's no way around that. So it's like if you're not thinking about it, you should be. Otherwise, you're going to lose out to your competitor who is.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot. The things you're talking about are very much the next generation of this function. The tools that you're looking at, quite frankly, many of them are the ones that when I talk to the smartest people in talent acquisition, those are the tools they're looking at, in addition to many others. But I feel very strongly that you are very correct in that, especially fast growing companies, it used to be even like a couple of well-run TA teams, even up to 5 years ago, like you want to scale, just throw bodies at it, more recruiters. Nobody's thinking, even when you've got hundreds of recruiters, nobody's really thinking strategically about process and systems beyond maybe the leadership of the team. And they're busy managing and hiring and coaching people. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing about your own personal career path, kind of what you're up to, some of these generalizable lessons that folks can learn for themselves, for their organizations, as well as just some of the stuff that you guys are doing, because I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. And, Also, I'm 5 months in, right? So I'm learning a lot as I go. But it's been an amazing, experience to be introduced to this field. It's very interesting to me. And that's one last thing that I would say to anybody considering it is you don't need to just look in the box of people who have recruiting and talent experience, right? Like you mentioned before, it is akin to consulting in a lot of ways. And, I think that there's lots of people that would be interested in this sort of role and maybe just like me, didn't know it existed.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And we're going to see more people with those sorts of backgrounds come in and hit the ground running, I think, for a lot of companies.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate it, man. It's always fun to catch up. I'll talk to you soon. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Yes, thank you.